Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's Reclaiming the Promise conversation, sponsored by the Albert Shanker Institute and the AFT. I'm happy to welcome you on behalf of Leo Casey, the Executive Director of the Shanker Institute, who's in the front row, and on behalf of Randy Weingarten, AFT President, who's not able to be with us today. I want to welcome those who are in the room. It's great to see a terrific group, and also those who are watching the live stream on the web. Welcome. So our topic today is how do we get experienced, accomplished teachers into high-need schools? This series of conversations with the Albert Shanker Institute is a forum for lively and informative discussions on important educational topics. And we've clearly got that today, a critical topic and a very distinguished panel. Let me introduce myself, the non-distinguished part of the panel. My name is Marla Uccelli-Kashap. I'm Assistant to the President and Head of Educational Issues here at AFT. Our topic today, teaching quality, what supports it, how to get it where it's most needed, has been one of professional and personal interest to me for a long time. In fact, going back to my years at the Rockefeller Foundation, where I had the privilege of helping to design and launch the National Commission on Teaching in America's Future, and be part of its seminal report, What Matters Most. And Melinda, glad you're here today. So, while we know that differences in teaching quality actually reflect a relatively small portion of the overall achievement gap, we also know that teaching is the most important in-school factor in student achievement, and each of us knows very personally the difference that one teacher can make. We also know that students in poverty are disproportionately taught by the most novice teachers, too many of whom don't have all the preparation that they need or all the support that they need to be successful. Just last week, not even a week ago, the Department of Education issued in a Dear Colleague letter some new guidance from the Office of Civil Rights that connects to the distribution of teachers and noted that disparities in access to resources between poor and minority students and their more advantaged peers must be addressed, and that OCR can use data related to teacher distribution to figure out and to decide to investigate schools, districts, and states to see if they are doing enough to remedy that inequity. So there's much more that could be said about the context for our conversation, but let's focus on the two big questions that we're gathered here today to deal with. What are the systemic causes of the mismatch of educational resources and needs, and what policies could be adopted to remedy that mismatch and to attract experienced, accomplished teachers into schools with high educational needs? As I said, we have a distinguished panel. I'm going to introduce each of them to you in a moment. Each of them will have 12 to 15 minutes to speak, and they will have Leo in the front row to give them a little warning when they're closing in on that time. When all of them have had a chance to share, I will ask them the first question, and then we'll open it up to you, to your questions. So when it's your turn, you may have noticed that there are little index cards on your chair. Those little index cards are there for you to ask questions. Please write them more legibly than I write. Our wonderful staff will collect them, bring them here, and I will get to ask them of our panel. I am now really delighted to introduce our panelists in the order in which they will speak. I'm coming to that, but I'll say it now. So when you want to tweet about this, as I'm sure you will, we are going to be using the hashtag #TeacherEquity, and I'll remind you of that later in our conversation as well. So I'm only going to give you a tiny taste of the distinguished careers of the four people who are sitting to my left. There's much more that you can read about them in the packets that were provided when you came in. So I'm going to start with Mary Catherine to my immediate left. Mary Catherine Ricker was elected Executive Vice President of AFT in July of this year. She has served as the president of the St. Paul Federation of Teachers since 2005 and as an AFT vice president since 2012. As a local president, Mary Catherine championed teacher-built solutions to improve instruction and to improve public education and also to increase community and family engagement. Mary Catherine is also a nationally board-certified middle school English teacher and is now a member of the board of directors of the National Board. To Mary Catherine's left is Richard Ingersoll. Richard is the Board of Overseers Professor of Education and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. He's published more than 100 articles, reports, chapters, and essays, and is considered a leading authority on the job of teaching and key issues like supply, demand, shortage, and turnover. He's an award-winning researcher and speaker whose work has been cited from universities to professional associations to the halls of Congress to the White House. And next to Richard is Helen Ladd. Helen is the Susan B. King Professor of Public Policy and a Professor of Economics at Duke University. Her research interests include teacher labor markets, school accountability, and education finance. She's co-authored books on education reform in New Zealand and South Africa. And since its founding in 2008, Helen has been a co-chair of the national campaign known as the Broader, Bolder Approach to Education. All the way at the end is Peter McWalters. Peter is currently a consultant on education systems effectiveness. He is also a distinguished lifelong educator, having served as a teacher of English language learners, a superintendent in Rochester City Schools, and as Rhode Island Commissioner of Elementary and Secondary Education, where during his long tenure he implemented grade-level content standards and aligned assessments. And as a board member of the Council of Chief State School Officers, Peter advocated for the development of the Common Core state standards. There's so much more to say about each of our panelists, but I suspect that you would rather hear from them than hear me talk about them, but I do encourage you to read their bios. A reminder that you can tweet at the hashtag #TeacherEquity, and I think we should start off the panel with a welcoming round of applause.
All right.
Mary Catherine, would you lead us off?
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate. Pull this forward. Okay. I would actually like to start off my comments by doing something I often used as a warm-up exercise in my classrooms, just to make sure that I could kind of survey who was in the room. So would you raise your hand if you are now or have ever been a teacher? And those of you virtually can tweet at me telling me you're a teacher. Would you raise your hand if you are now, have been, or plan to be a parent? It's me too. All right, any of you who is a community member who cares about the schools in your community? Anyone in the room? Okay. Is there anyone in the room who is either now or ever has been a student? Okay, so I think what we gathered from that survey is that clearly, for most of us in this room, I think I'm safe to say all of us in this room, we have an interest in this subject that is more than academic, right? We have a personal interest in this subject. We have a personal experience. And so I filter as much as I really care about the academic work that helps shape my work as a teacher, as a union leader. I also know that tapping into my experiences also helps inform my approach to this work. And so I would also start by saying, in the majority of conversations I have had about this, as a mom, as a teacher, as a union leader, I have found vast agreement on the idea that every child in school should be taught by a strong teacher. That the front of every classroom should have someone who is there to meet the needs of the students. And so I also want to point out, though, too, like virtually every other educational issue, we really can't address this in isolation. And actually, the best solutions out there, you'll see, do not address hard-to-staff schools, teacher shortages in isolation. Recruiting and retaining accomplished teachers to high-need areas means we actually need wall-to-wall accomplished teachers. There is no student out there who deserves the less accomplished teacher, right? We actually need, it means we need to address this idea of wall-to-wall accomplished teachers, which means thoughtful preparation, it means evaluation and support, and it means high-quality ongoing professional development activities to keep an accomplished teaching force in front of our students. It means that we need the skills to accurately diagnose why a school may be hard to staff, rather than assuming, and then making sure that we actually have the resources to to apply that remedy for once we discover. So for example, if we discover that a school is struggling with difficult management, it's not going to help the school to remove 50% of the teachers in that school, because that doesn't address the difficult management issue. And it also means rethinking policies, for example, like removing 50% of the teachers that actually contribute to this churn that exists, and it doesn't solve a hard-to-staff school issue. And so let me also continue by saying that in all of my years as a teacher, I've never met a teacher who's left a building because of the student population. And that is my 9 years as a union leader as well. When I would go into schools that were feeling incredible pressure, really depressing school climate, and just were very unhappy in their building, they never wanted to leave the students. Additionally, in the same way, in 13 years of teaching and all the parent-teacher conferences and visits and all of that entailed, I never met a parent who didn't care desperately about their child or their children, right? So with those two things, I think what that means is we've actually got, in many cases, a very powerful partnership addressing this issue in the United States, and in some other cases, we've got the potential for that powerful partnership of teachers and families who can address this. And so it means, though, that sort of partnership, going after those other issues that keep teachers from being able to do their jobs at times. It means working with families for healthy, supportive, strong learning environments. And I want to reflect on some personal experiences. It means the union being able to play a key role in effectively staffing a building and supporting that building of professionals as they meet the needs of students. I want to talk specifically about a couple things I had the opportunity to do as a local president in St. Paul before being elected to executive vice president at AFT. A few years ago, some of you may be familiar with the New Haven contract language that helped restructure schools. And it drove decision-making into the school building that was labeled in need of restructuring, and it allowed for a certain number of contract areas to be opened. So just a little anecdote, once that contract language got approved in New Haven, AFT sent out an email to, I think it was probably to local leaders across the country, just saying, hey, we just did this cool thing in New Haven. So it's a Tuesday night. I'm sitting at my school board meeting, and I was reading my email during the school board meeting, and I noticed this email comes in, and I start reading the language, and one of my organizers is sitting next to me, and I turned my laptop to him, and I said, I think this is the language we've been looking for. By that Thursday, we had it at our bargaining table, and a month later, we had negotiated it successfully, with a few tweaks that are more St. Paul focused than New Haven focused, of course, and we had that language. So what that did is, when a school got labeled in need of restructuring, rather than a top-down approach, which I would say often meant applying a remedy without diagnosing what the problem was, we actually drove decision-making about restructuring schools into that school community so that teachers and administrators and educational support professionals and families could design the restructuring. What we did is we micro-bargained contracts for those sites so that we wouldn't have to pay a treatment to 38,000 students when we were really trying to get at the 400 students in this building, right? We wouldn't have to have 3,000 teachers try something if these 70 teachers or these 40 teachers were willing to try something. And so we would micro-bargain these contracts, and then a teacher would sign an election to work agreement after we bargained to say, yes, I want to continue and I want to do what we have micro-bargained at this site. Or they would say, you know what, good luck. I would actually prefer to go to a building that has the traditional contract rules. And everybody understood that that was just as valuable a part of the process. Because if for example, in a handful of the cases, we negotiated a longer school day. And if that didn't fit your teacher day for some reason, because, for some of us, our daycares wouldn't open till 7:30 and there was just no, and closed by 4:30, there was just no way for me to stretch my day, as one example. Or maybe you had elder care, or it didn't matter. You could say this, a stretched school day may not fit. I'm going to go to a traditional school day. And so 18 election to work agreements later, where we have tried this in a variety of settings for a variety of reasons, just last year, the St. Paul Federation of Teachers went back to the bargaining table and said, you know what? We actually, we've had some experimenting. This is working. This is stabilizing the teaching forces in these buildings as opposed to trying to just remove 20 teachers and see if that fixes anything. And we said, why make a school building wait until they are labeled in need of restructuring? Right? Let's rewrite this contract language so that if a supermajority of teachers vote to access this contract language about micro-bargaining the contract, why make them wait until they've gotten, some regressive label? If they have a really brilliant idea, why not let them work with that idea? Again, you'd need a supermajority of teachers to vote to access that contract language. So it's not an easy lift, right? You are doing some internal organizing in your building. It's not like 3 or 4 teachers could just say, hey, we want to rewrite, our school day and stretch it, or we want to change this about the budget, or we want to change this curriculum. It takes a very broad consensus. So we rewrote and won contract language for a 2013-15 contract that said, now it is called redesigned schools language. And so now teachers do not have to wait for that moment where things are just, the school climate is really, suppressed and depressed. They don't have to wait until federal government or the Board of Education or something labels their school in need of restructuring. School redesign is a whole different way of looking at this and actually having teachers anticipate problems that may be coming up and be part of the solution immediately. I would also say, as a union leader, I've now had the chance to visit the Oliver Partnership School in Lawrence, Massachusetts, which does feel like a bit like a pilgrimage to a union leader. This is a school that is a real testimony to the school district administration, who understands the power of working with teachers and our union. It's a place where teacher voice is able to solve problems, create solutions, and really address children's issues. In a school where this kind of trust and partnership have actually been proven to positively impact student achievement. I am going to bet that this is not going to be a hard-to-staff school as long as these conditions stay in place. These professional conditions are going to be what keep that staff healthy, happy, and retained, quite frankly. And I want to focus on, as a National Board Certified teacher, reflection is a deliberate part of not only earning your National Board certification, but in the practice of an accomplished teacher who's earned their National Board certification. And oftentimes, so what a National Board Certified teacher and others will recognize is the accountability movement, as it has been, has started with the question of, is the teacher doing her job or his job? And I actually think that's the wrong place to start the conversation. It is an imperative question to ask in any accountability framework. But one of the reasons we need a new accountability framework is that we actually have to nest that question in first, is the teacher given support and resources necessary to do the job? That is part of diagnosing any school, let alone a hard-to-staff school. Then saying, with that in place, is the teacher doing her job or his job? Absolutely, you ask that question. And that's how this is nested into a strong support and evaluation framework. And then the third question, which is a deliberate part of strong evaluation programs, is, are the students learning? Right? And it is a question accomplished teachers ask all the time, sometimes by the minute, right? For those of you who have been teachers, are they picking up this concept I'm delivering to them right now? Sometimes, after a big six-week lesson, right? Teachers are measuring student learning all the time and feeding that back into, am I doing my job? And then that should then feed into the larger question. So these are questions that keep feeding into each other, right? So if I am not doing my job, what support and resources do I need to do my job? So those questions both flow into the accountability framework, and then the teacher and students have those questions flow back out of it as well. And I would also like to talk a little bit about my experience, not only growing up, but my experience as an AFT member watching the American Federation of Teachers become deeply involved in McDowell County. Oftentimes, my frustration with the question of hard-to-staff schools or the debate or the discussion around hard-to-staff schools is focused on assuming this is an urban problem. This is a problem St. Paul Public Schools may have, that being my home district, or this is a problem a district with 15 high schools has. When this is an American problem, the rural America, when I saw rural Minnesota, this hard-to-staff schools are an issue both in big districts as well as in some of the smallest districts in the United States. So any thoughtful conversation about hard-to-staff schools and about attracting and retaining accomplished teachers has to include a conversation about rural America as well. There are many schools and many school districts where we're not talking about the good biology teacher and the bad biology teacher, right? We are talking about a district that is struggling to attract a biology teacher. And if some of you may have seen the recent New York Times story that said we are currently a shortfall of 380,000 jobs in public education. Those are not just urban jobs or suburban jobs. Those are rural jobs as well. And so some of you know the American Federation of Teachers work in McDowell County. It is one rural example that we need to keep in mind as we address the idea of attracting accomplished teachers to be retained in front of our students. McDowell County is one of the poorest counties in the nation. 43 teacher vacancies out of 350 teaching positions on the first day of school. That is a massive number of teachers to attract and retain in a system that, those are gaps, like huge gaping holes in a system. Those are not like, plug in and Mary Catherine just misses her prep for a few days while they, find another English teacher to join my staff. Those are huge gaps. It is a high poverty, isolated area with limited housing available. So one of the things AFT is doing in their partnership is we are creating an actual teacher village so that we can address, again, you diagnose the problem with attracting 43 additional teachers to McDowell County, and now you apply the right remedy, right? And one of the remedies we've noticed, for example, is a teacher village. So I would say that ultimately, we certainly need to move away from toxic policies that focus on breaking teachers down instead of building us up. Because teaching is an honorable, noble profession of professionals, we need to include teachers in the solutions in these policies. And when we treat them in a way by giving us what we need to do our jobs, addressing the complex problems we are diagnosing, we are going to solve this problem together, and we're going to see really creative, enduring solutions to this problem as well. So thank you very much for allowing me to speak today.
Thank you, Mary Catherine. We are moving next to Richard, and I understand we have a little bit of a technical difficulty. So what I'm going to ask people to do is take Richard's slides out of their packets in case you are not going to see them while he is speaking. So I'm sure there are more packets outside, or Vicki can bring some in if folks don't have them. Okay, great. Now that we're all on the same page, so to speak, Richard. There we go.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Somehow it reminds me when I was.
Oops. I'm trying to turn mine off.
I hope that's on. Technology is it's very dependable that it will go down. So at any event, I do have some data. That's what I do, and I'll be talking from the slides, and hopefully they'll come up on the screens, but perhaps not. So I do a lot of research on teachers and the teaching occupation, and have been over the last couple decades. I'm a former high school teacher, and I was always taken aback at how many problems there were in the job. I first taught in Western Canada, then I moved back to this area. I grew up in Delaware, and I'm very sorry to say that in almost any indicator I could give you, the teaching job as a job was much better there, Canada, than here, the U.S., and I always wondered why, and eventually I quit, and I've been trying to answer that ever since. But at any event, I'm going to speak a little bit today about one of the major explanations and answers to the question that motivates this meeting, which is that why are hard-to-staff schools hard to staff? Why do the poor schools have such difficulty having qualified teachers in there? And the view that I'm going to talk about is this big elephant, the teacher shortages. And you've all heard this theory. It's totally accepted as fact, which is that we don't produce enough teachers, and we don't have enough, and so the poor schools really suffer, and they have to make do with what they have, and they get the worst teachers, et cetera, et cetera. And this is particularly true for some subjects like math and science. Everyone believes it's sort of a holy grail that, or an established fact, that we have a shortage of math science teachers. And so, of course, the antidote, the solution to this problem is bring in more. And so we have all kinds of very interesting initiatives out there, district, state, federal, to bring in more teachers, often particularly math science teachers or minority teachers, to bring them in, particularly in these poor schools. Now, it turns out that teacher shortages as an explanation is not new. One of my bright doctoral students found that almost every president since Eisenhower at one point or another had given a speech about teacher shortages. And of course, we've had these solutions going on for, well, that's well over half a century. But they haven't worked, have they? So I've been doing research on this whole issue of teacher shortages, and particularly as an explanation of poor schools, hard-to-staff schools. And I've come to the conclusion that really it's a case of a wrong diagnosis and a wrong series of prescriptions. So just a quick word, hopefully this, my source of data, just a very quick word. I'm working with national data here. It's called the Schools and Staffing Survey, done by U.S. Department of Education and the Census Bureau. Very, very large source of information on teachers, and more importantly, we've had it since the late 1980s, over time. What do these data tell us? Well, first, these data tell us that, yes, it is true that there's a significant number of schools out there that do indeed have difficulties filling their positions. They have hiring difficulties, and that these schools are disproportionately poor schools, disadvantaged schools, etc. That is true. After that, the conventional wisdom sort of goes south, so to speak. It's not true, the data tell us, that we have a shortage of qualified teachers. That's not really the problem. So, for instance, we've meticulously quantified and evaluated the sufficiency of the math science teacher supply. We did this. It's a project. You can see it on my webpage. I know this is heresy, but this country actually produces more than enough qualified math science teachers, certainly more than enough to keep up with math science student enrollments, more than enough to keep up with increasing math science teacher retirements. The problem is not on the supply side. It's not that we produce too few qualified teachers and these poor schools get the short end of the stick. No, the problem is turnover. It's not that we produce too few, it's that we lose too many. Pre-retirement turnover is the problem here. Our diagnosis has been wrong. And just to try to illustrate this, I'll go to this next slide here. Revolving door. So the teaching occupation, elementary, secondary teaching, is now the largest occupation in the nation. It's a gigantic, oops, that's okay. There's twice as many teachers as nurses, which is another large occupation. 5 times as many teachers as lawyers, and we have a lot of lawyers in this country. And so you have this gigantic occupation, which has a great deal of job transition, and I'm trying to capture that in that slide. So the yellow arrow is the numbers of teachers that came into schools at the beginning of that given school year. It's the 07-08 school year, and don't have my glasses on, but it's something around. And then 10 to 12 months later, a larger number note leave schools. That's the light blue arrow. So what this figure tells us is that almost a third, well over 1 million teachers, of the largest occupation in the nation, each and every year are in job transition. The term we use to describe this phenomena in occupations is the revolving door. This is an occupation in which there's a great deal of movement into, between, and out of schools every year. Revolving door. A huge, almost a third of the largest occupation in the nation is switching schools every year or getting out. Now, of course, there's no assumption here that all this turnover, this attrition, this quitting is bad. Of course, you would never get, nor you'd ever want 100% retention. Some people you want to leave, and perhaps we don't have enough of, let's call it good turnover. People that really shouldn't be teachers that should move on. So it's not all bad by any means, and there's a great deal of research in other occupations and industries on the pluses and negatives, the costs and benefits of employee turnover. And it's completely understood, widely understood, that while it's not all some benefits, employee turnover is not cost-free. There's large costs here. And one of the costs and consequences I've come to the conclusion is that the shortages. That is a consequence of having a very revolving door, high turnover occupation. Now, the next slide does a comparison. You might ask, well, what's the turnover in the teaching occupation compared to others? And we've done analyses on these national data. Fourth slide, where it follows a college class across the nation workforce and picks them up to down, and we've been able to compare the attrition rates. And you'll see there are some kinds of work higher attrition than does teaching. Secretaries, child care workers, paralegals, correctional officers. Okay? Teaching has higher even than police. That took me by surprise. I'm assuming police is high-stress work. And of course, much higher than those traditional, more prestigious professions. But it's important to remember that the revolving door revolves at different rates. So when I talk nationally like this, it masks the real story I want to get to today, which is the revolving door revolves faster than others, and for some teachers much faster. It particularly revolves quickly for beginners, and that's that next slide, which is beginners in the occupation, and it shows that after 5 years, between 40 and 50% are gone of those who came in. These are very accurate figures. A decade ago, we generated this figure that between 40 and 50% have left, and it's been widely publicized all over the place, and it was a crude approximation. I was always kind of embarrassed about it, how widely spread it was cited, but it turns out we have more exact data, and it was pretty accurate all along. So beginners, they have the highest rates, and then it slows down. The next slide shows that there's very large school-to-school differences in teacher turnover. And this is a statistical analysis where we just basically sort of compare the averages across types of schools. And notice those poor schools tend to have 2.5 times the rate of these poor schools. This important question, the why question. Why is it that teaching as an occupation has high turnover and attrition rates? More particularly, why is it that some kinds of schools need teachers? Room, so I got to be teacher here. Just have to do this booming voice. Am I too close? Is that the problem?
There was something wrong with that.
No, it's the microphone.
All right. I'm sure if we went around the room, we'd have 100 different hypotheses, answers to the why question. Why do people quit teaching? And we noticed hands earlier, a bunch of you have done it. And actually, I forgot a slide. Before we get to that, I have a slide here, the one with the dark background, that just further brings home the point of how teacher turnover is not equally distributed across schools and it's concentrated. So this is an analysis where we found that almost half of all the teachers turning over in a given year, that takes place in a quarter of the schools. It's highly concentrated. Some schools do not lose teachers. Other schools lose a lot of teachers every year. And those schools that lose a lot of teachers every year are disproportionately poor, disadvantaged. those kinds of analyses. Let me circle back now to the why question, excuse me there. So we have a series of different reasons teachers give. These are self-report data as to why you moved from or left your school, and you can see the largest one there is dissatisfaction. There's other reasons. It's not the only one. For instance, that family and personal, that's just part of life. You know, I left my school because my spouse moved. I wanted to raise babies, care for my folks, elderly folks. I had health concerns. That happens in any line of work. You're going to have people, employees leaving for those reasons. The dissatisfaction one is the one that's troubling to me. It's the longest. It's the biggest. The biggest reason behind these very high rates is dissatisfaction. So then the next question is, well, what's the source of the dissatisfaction? Again, if we went around the room, I'm sure we could have a lot of interesting hypotheses. The national data are in the next slide. Teachers are asked what are their gripes. And again, this isn't the national, this is the big picture. And it's a rundown here. Now, a couple interesting things to point out about this chart. First of all, not all these things cost money. Salary and benefits, they're important, no doubt, but they're not the top of the list. Remember, it's a gigantic occupation. I figured this out, I don't have the number with me. If we just raised all the teacher salaries $1,000 a year, which isn't much, it's a very, very big ticket item. I'm not making an argument against raising teacher salaries, I'm saying it's daunting. But notice a bunch of these things, like for instance, the one there about lack of faculty influence. That's the issue of how much say do the faculty have in the key decisions in the building that affect their jobs. It turns out that the poor schools, particularly poor urban schools, the teachers have less say. They're more centralized. Philadelphia is a key example. This is going on. That's management. That doesn't cost money to fix that. That's how do we treat these people. So notice these issues here. Notice how far we come from that conventional wisdom that the answer to the question of, why are the hardest staff schools hard to staff? The conventional wisdom, well, it's shortages. Think how far we've come here. The problem's not out there that we produce too few teachers and we have, student increases and teacher retirement increases. No, the problem is in here, in schools, how they're operated and run. What a different diagnosis and a different set of prescriptions we have coming from the data-driven diagnosis and prescriptions. So just to wrap up then, everybody believes we have these teacher shortages and they disproportionately fall on the disadvantaged and poor schools. And gosh, we need to have dozens of teacher recruitment efforts to bring in more people. There's nothing wrong with luring bright math, science majors into teaching, etc. But it hasn't worked, and it's not going to work, unfortunately, is my conclusion. It's not going to work if we lose 40 to 50% within the first 5 years. In other words, the problem, the diagnosis isn't shortages. It's too much turnover, and hence the solution, the prescription, isn't just recruitment. It's got to include retention. Retention. And these data point to how we could do retention. And not all of these fixes cost money. So just to wrap up, my simple-minded answer to the question, what's the problem behind these hard-to-staff schools? It's really very simple. The way to improve student achievement and learning is to improve the quality of teachers and teaching. And the way to do that is to improve the quality of the teaching job. I don't think there's any shortcuts. I think that's what we need to do in this country. Now, I think I have 15 seconds. I just want to mention two other studies. One is that with Esther Quintero, who works here at the Albert Shanker Institute, we're now doing a minority teacher shortage, and I just want to make a note of it. The report should come out this fall. Minority teacher shortage, which is very parallel. It's a sort of a subset of the teacher shortage. We've all heard this argument that the teaching force doesn't look like America. America's becoming increasingly racially, ethnic diverse, and the teaching force is doing the opposite. And so we have dozens and dozens, and we've spent many millions of dollars recruiting minority teachers over the last couple decades. It turns out that there's been an unheralded success. We have brought in thousands and thousands of minority teachers. There's been an actually unheralded success, but there's a huge but here, which is that minority teachers have significantly higher turnover and quit rates than do white non-minority teachers. And so again, this is a case where it can't just be recruitment, it also needs to have retention. And so Esther and I, during this project, we're looking at very interesting, innovative minority initiatives out there, minority teacher initiatives that don't just look at recruitment, they also look at retention. So I just want to give a plug for that. We hope to finish that report this fall. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Terrific information, though. I want to apologize to everyone for our technical challenges. I think we're going to have the same issue as we turn to Helen in terms of, again, you've got the PowerPoint in your packets, so please follow along with her presentation. And Vicki is standing in the back. As you have questions, you can feel free to slip them to her. I hope you're filling out your index cards for when we get to questions. And now let's move to Helen.
So thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I'm also pleased to follow Richard because he gave a national perspective. I'm going to focus in and talk more about my research on a specific state, which is the state of North Carolina, which is where I live. I love talking about North Carolina in events like this because, as I'm sure you all know, North Carolina doesn't have collective bargaining power for unions. We have just an association of educators. So that means it's not possible to blame some of the undesirable outcomes on unions. Those undesirable outcomes, in many cases, just reflect the operation of the teacher labor market. I would argue that's the case in other states as well, but it's easier to make that strong statement in the context of North Carolina. I've listed in your handout some of the sources on which I'm relying. I do a lot of work with various colleagues at Duke, and I think a couple of the papers are in your packet. Before I get into the issue that I want to focus on, which is what are the policy options to make it easier to not only get accomplished teachers into high-need schools, but as Richard emphasized, to retain them. And I think retention is an important part. I've just provided a little data in the handout. I'll go very quickly. In my colleagues and I have done a lot of analysis, just distributional type of analysis. We divided all the schools by level, elementary school level, middle, and high school, by the percentage of students in poverty. So quartile 1 schools are those with the highest percentages of poverty. And the only thing I'm showing in this first graph is that whatever level of schooling you're talking about, we have higher proportions of novice teachers or teachers with less than 3 years of experience. If you go to the next graph, you see a graph that goes in the other direction, but that's because I'm talking about a characteristic that we all believe to be positive and has shown to be positive for student achievement, national board certification. North Carolina has a very high percentage of teachers who are nationally board certified, but here we have a similar pattern, goes in the other direction, but consistent with the first graph, which is the high poverty schools have lower proportions of national board certified teachers. So I just present that as background. The next slide simply says this pattern that I've shown for these two qualifications of teachers apply or emerge for every other characteristic that I've looked at, such as percentage of or average teacher licensure test scores, or uncertified teachers, or teachers from highly ranked education institutions or whatever. And also, if I did this for principals with slightly different measures of qualifications, the same pattern would emerge. So that's just the starting point for where I want to go. Now, the next slide talks very briefly about the explanation for this. And what I'm focusing on here is the differences between the high-need schools and the lower need schools. We all know that the working conditions in the high need schools are difficult. And they're not fully compensated for by salary differentials. So we know that from the data, and I've looked at patterns of teacher movement, but lots of people have done this for other states as well. Teachers move away from high-need schools. They might start out in a high-need school, and they move to schools with lower proportions of needy students. The result is higher teacher turnover in those high-need schools. So then they have to hire more teachers. The teachers they hire are often the less experienced teachers. That's consistent with the data that I gave you. And in addition, some of this movement is exacerbated by accountability pressures. That was particularly true in North Carolina, and we've documented that. We had a pretty good accountability system for a while before No Child Left Behind. We still have it in part, that focused on gains in student achievement, and it had bonuses for teachers in the high-performing schools. But what did that mean? That the teachers who were in the high-need schools couldn't earn those bonuses if they remained in those schools. So this exacerbated the movement of the teachers with strong qualifications out of those schools toward other schools. So then the question is, what do we do about it? For those of you who are streaming in, I have one final slide, which I'm going to talk about for the rest of my time. And this is labeled potential policy. Salary differentials, strong school leadership, and policies to offset the challenges that disadvantaged children come to school. So let's start with the policy option of salary differentials. So primarily I'm talking about higher salaries for teaching in the high schools. So I'm an economist by training, I'm an academic. I want to bring evidence to bear on this. And I want to refer to two studies that we've done in North Carolina. The first one is based on an $1,800 annual bonus for teachers in STEM fields in high-need schools. This was a bonus program that the state legislature introduced in 2002. Unfortunately, they ended it in 2004. So my colleagues and I were brought in to evaluate this program, and we had a lot of capacity to evaluate it because we had longitudinal data from all teachers in the state, so we could look at trends in the high-need schools before these teachers came in and after, and we could look at the retention rates. And we also could look at what was happening within schools, because this particular program was focused on teachers teaching in hard-to-staff areas. So the teachers who were eligible were teachers teaching math and special ed in eligible school. And the eligible schools were middle school or high school that were either high need, as defined by having more than 80% of their children on free and reduced price lunch, or had a lot of low performing students, and the criterion there was more than 50 or less than 50% of their students taking the Algebra 1 or biology courses level. It's low-performing students. So we had all of this data. We also supplemented our analysis with interviews and surveys, interviews of some of the superintendents and principals, and also surveys of teachers. So what did we find? Did this salary bonus, and it was a bonus. A teacher would keep the bonus. It wasn't just 1 year, it was an annual bonus. The teacher would keep the bonus as long as she was teaching in the high-need subject area in an eligible school. And basically we found there were some clear implementation problems initially with this program. So as a result, school principals and superintendents were not able to use this program to recruit. In part, that was because the program first year was introduced that first year. But also the students that we talked to that would not be permanent or might just be temporary. And in fact, that concern turned out to be true. So it wasn't helpful, the program wasn't helpful for those two reasons in terms of recruiting new students, new teachers to those schools in these hard-to-staff areas. But we did find clear evidence that it affected the willingness of teachers to stay in those schools. So we found that the departure rate decreased by 17% for the teachers who were eligible in these schools. So you've got the details of the paper in your folder, but we thought that was an important finding, and that happened, despite some of the implementation problems. We found from the surveys of teachers that they didn't understand all the provisions of this, and that was not too surprising because it was complicated. There were some elements of the program that were actually well designed, but they passed over the teachers because nobody explained to teachers exactly what the details of this program were. And then, as I've already mentioned, the program was ended by the legislature 2 years later before we completed our evaluation. So my own view about the program is it had potential to be successful. So we've also turned to a broader study of the effect of salary differentials on the ability of schools to attract teachers with strong qualifications. So this study is different in nature. We were taking advantage of longitudinal data that we had over time and drawing inferences from the way teachers had responded to salary differentials across districts and over time. We were looking at teachers during the period 1995 to 2004 and looking at the probability that something would happen. So our first question was, how big would the salary differential have to be to level the playing field across schools with different proportions, say, of minority students, in terms of the ability of the schools to fill vacancies with high-quality teachers? So by high-quality teachers, I'm talking about teachers who had high licensure test scores, who had experience or were national board certified. Now, the answer to that question turns out to depend on how big the differences across schools are. So if we focus on the simplest measure here, just the percent of minority students in the schools, if you just have a 20 percentage point difference in the schools, so we're talking about schools that might have 15% minority versus 35 percentage difference, what you find is that the salary differential would have to be 4%. You'd have to pay the schools with the higher percent of minority students would have to pay 4% more. That's not a lot more. But what happens if the districts, or the schools and the districts, had much greater differences, so that you have some schools with 25% minority students and others with 75% minority students? Then you'd have to, according to our estimates, you'd have to pay 13% more to level the playing field in terms of filling these vacancies. Now, 13% of a base salary of $40,000 is a bit over $4,000. So that's a lot higher than the bonus that I was talking about a little earlier. So it's relatively high, but it does show that salary differences can help to offset these differences. But my second question is, how big would the salary differentials have to be to retain teachers in these high-need schools? Think about it just as having high percentages of minority students, although we've got many other measures in here. Now here, the good news is that even if you have very big differences across schools, say a 50 percentage point difference in the percent of minority students, a 7.5% salary difference could help, according to our estimates, offset that differential, compensate for that differential. That's the good news. 7.5% may be high, but it's not as high as the number I'm about to give you. If you wanted to retain the teachers with the strong qualifications, those who have high test scores, for example, in these schools, you might have to pay salaries that are 50% higher. So salary differentials would have to be huge to to retain those teachers with strong qualifications. And that's because those teachers are less or more reluctant to teach in those high-need schools and less responsive to salary differentials. So salary differentials can play some role, but they could be very costly. I'll spend much time. One is strong leadership in the schools. So I've done some work using the North Carolina Working Conditions Survey. Ever since 2004, the state every 2 years has been implementing or administering a survey of all teachers in the state with pretty good coverage, asking the teachers about their working conditions and asking them about their intents to stay in, or their intentions about staying in the school or moving. We also have data on actual movements out of the school. Now, we started out with a whole range of working conditions as perceived by the teachers. And then we grouped those into categories using the statistical tool of factor analysis. And the bottom line of this analysis is that the key factor that matters among other working conditions that play some role is school leadership. Leadership, leadership, leadership. And that just emerges very clearly in all our different parts of the analysis, where leadership, and this is an important point, is broadly defined to include what some people might refer to as transformational leadership. So it's not just sort of individual or attention just to instructional issues. It's setting the tone for the school, getting the teachers involved in the mission of the school, and in addressing problems. But there is no doubt in my mind that school leadership matters, and it always amazes me in all of this discussion about teachers and how we need to make teachers better and putting the blame on a lot of teachers that we don't pay as much attention to making sure that we've got good leaders in these schools. So let me turn to my third policy option, which is near and dear to my heart, but I'm just going to say a very little amount about it. We know that teachers are going to be more satisfied in their jobs if they feel like they're being effective. So what is it that makes teachers feel effective? Well, they've got some control over their life, but they're teaching students and students are learning in the class. But if the students are coming to high-need schools with very large challenges in many cases that reflect what's going on outside of the classroom, so they're coming to school hungry in the morning, or they're homeless or whatever, or they have asthma and not dealing with it. Some of them can't see the blackboard. If we don't deal with those challenges that arise disproportionately in high-need schools, the teachers are going to have a tough job, and that job is the difficulty of that job is exacerbated in the high accountability or high-stakes accountability framework in which we're currently working. So it was mentioned earlier, I'm co-chair of the National Task Force on broader, bolder approach to education. I think we need to pay attention to the proposals of that group, making sure we have good early childhood, good health clinics in schools where appropriate, more nurses, more support staff, better afternoon and summer programs so that the teachers are in a position to be effective in those schools. And that, I think, would help retain them in those schools.
Thank you, Helen. Fascinating information on your North Carolina study. I would say that Peter is batting cleanup, except since I no longer have any teams in the postseason, I'm refusing to use baseball metaphors. But Peter.
Get up conversation. Come at this a little bit from the state perspective, being a former commissioner, but that's only to remind us the context is significant, both in terms of the, as Mary Catherine was talking about, the context of your local environment, whether it's the school, the district, the county, I would suggest the state, and at least for the last, well, actually, since building evidence since 1983, but certainly for the last decade, federal context, some implications for whether or not you can, what you feel like as a teacher, and engage in this conversation. And I was, it intrigued me that we suggested,
Hello there.
no, that's a joke. I thought it was interesting that this was intentionally, how do you get experienced and accomplished teachers into high-need schools as opposed to highly effective? Because there's, one of the outstanding issues is right now in this country is how do you decide what is highly effective? What are the measures? What are the practices? Is it about instruction? Is it about dispositions? Is it about the level of collegial responsibility? I was on the InTask rewrite, and I was also on the Blue Ribbon Commission for NCATE, and I've been on almost the NEA Commission for Rethinking Teaching. And many of these images of what the frustrations are come back to pretty conventional understandings of what we've never done as a country. And that is actually, until recently, fundamentally accepted that the challenge was all kids, not some kids. So why am I surprised that the disproportionality sorts itself out by socioeconomics and/or concentrations of race? So that when I gave the first state test in Rhode Island, in a very tiny county-sized state, and the results lined up absolutely perfectly with socioeconomic income, and the results in each community was not a problem as long as that community landed where it expected to land. If they didn't land where they expected to land, all of a sudden there was something wrong. So that meant that as you came in the socioeconomic concentration, if you were in the inner city and you were better than the next one or whatever, it was a problem, but it was still somehow a zero-sum game. And I'm challenging us to try to accept the fact that the education infrastructure that we have developed together over 150 years has set up an expectation that comes out still predictably by class and race. Now, all of a sudden, because apparently the economy requires it, we now need to break through all of the infrastructure that's produced that and now get all kids to some sort of commonly agreed to high levels of performance. And how do we do that? Well, we keep thinking it's about infrastructure pieces, and it is. It is about recruitment and retention. It is about the quality of professional development. It's about all of those things, including finance, personnel, and whatever else. But the one thing that the two of us, as in labor management and policy, has somehow set up and avoided for all this time is what I would simply call Dick Elmer's thing, instruction. It's about teaching more than it is about the teacher. And so you get good people who are willing to take the risk to go to high-need places, and when they get there, it's a whole lot more complicated acting alone than it is in a system that the door is open, my stumbles are public, my feedback is supportive, and together we create the instructional environment to actually meet the needs of all kids. That is not the system we currently suggest we have. Now, we keep talking about it. The Blue Ribbon Commission said the whole preparation program should be turned on its head, and it should be much more clinically based. We have to figure out the roles of teachers in terms of career ladders, so you've got to agreed-to master teachers working constantly with beginning teachers in caseloads sufficient enough that they can actually, what I would call, perfect the craft. This is not about I like kids, and it's not even about I know my science. You need to know the science and how to teach it to all kinds of kids. That is not the current preparation trajectory. And in many cases, in terms of concentrations of high-need kids, it's complicated by concentration because one experimental design for instructional effectiveness may work today with some kids and not tomorrow with other kids. So we've got to get out from under this kind of just do it and test scores for either the kids or the teacher and start getting at the fact that this is really about practice. And in our industry, between the InTask experience and many, many other experiences, we're only beginning right now to begin to address the science of instruction, the practice of instruction. And I'm talking about the kind of work that people like Deborah Ball is doing. And if you take a look at that evidence about the absence of the diagnostics that we put teachers in the classrooms with, and I don't mean somebody who can cover the content and give the quiz and even get feedback on whether the kids, quote, got it. Remember, I taught it, but they didn't get it. But now I'm teaching it and they got it. That still is inadequate. because you have kids that are not getting it, but what they are producing has a logic to itself. It has an internal consistency that suggests they are learning, but there's an error in either their approach or simply as a mistake. And we do not have yet the sophistication of the diagnostics coming off of what the instructional barriers are or the kind of generalizations to, especially in the early grades of math. Think about, and I'm assuming you've all seen these good examples where there's 5 different versions to an answer in math, and they'll come up to the same answer with 5 different strategies, and if a child uses a strategy and then makes an error in the strategy, they don't get the right answer. And if you don't know that the strategy was right, but the error was an error, as opposed to the strategy was wrong, then the child is wrong, and we reteach, as in that kind of a strategy. So there's a couple of points I want to make and then kind of get on with it. I do think that there's some of this, I think the feds are into it whether we like it or not, and I was one that was welcoming that. As an urban superintendent in the 80s, and as a commissioner through the 90s, I would suggest that if we were going to solve this simply by going back to local control and those among the closest to know the best, it would have happened by now. So there are other things going on in this normative culture expectation and zero-sum game that suggest there is a state role and there is a federal role. Now, my recent experience would suggest that every time one of those 2 players gets into it, they overprescribe. Instead of playing the role of setting out a standard and a supportive infrastructure to find a way to get there and support those who are willing to take the greatest risk in terms of reinventing the system, we kind of put it out there as an event as opposed to a process. We instantly have a rubric that we make up out of whole cloth. And then when somebody doesn't hit the target, there's an accountability infrastructure that disincentivizes me to even want to step toward the work. Now, quite simply, any of us that have been through places where you have turned around a school, there's only a few systems that have kind of generally worked. One is, on paper, you empty out the kids and the teachers, and you put an incentive system to draw both. You have to worry about a diversified student population. If you do it right, you can do that. But it's one of those things that on paper you create a new opportunity to build a different culture. Then the other one is the kind Mary Catherine was talking about and others, where you actually go in and you stay with the group that's there, and you work on the quality of the leadership, and think about that in the context, where's the superintendent and the school board and other players around that leadership? Are they supportive of that kind of a leader? And can you support that leader over time as they build their own collaborative structure with their working people? So these things are very, very important. But I do think that some of the baseline stuff, like changing the preparation induction system, I do not know any big city. Most big cities have more capacity than most universities in terms of setting up good quality beginning teacher structures. But there's no money to do it. And the states, I would suggest, have to set up dynamics or infrastructure or incentive systems that make it actually part of, this is the way you get there. We're going to have what most people would call, professional learning teaching colleges, so that there's no such thing as somebody coming into an urban system or a hard-to-place place that hasn't been through an induction program that's clinical by nature, supervised by lots of players who have been there for a long time, and your feedback is constant, and it's the kind of thing that helps you build a craft. And I think that's a state role in collaboration with districts and universities. But this idea now of in the school, I'm the one that suggests you to take a look at Fuller's article about the wrong levers. In some ways, and I don't want to oversimplify this, even thinking about our conversation, this is not about finding individual teachers, and we all said that. This is at scale. You need, I thought, wall-to-wall, what was, Mary Catherine, what was your phrase? Wall-to-wall accomplished teachers. Assuming for a second that if we're honest about the Common Core without the current politic involved, but the acknowledgement that when we finally get to a common agreement of a higher level of expectation, then that begs the question that we aren't ready to be there or we would have been there. For those few years when you put out a higher expectation, you should have assumed we don't know how to do that. That to get there is to reinvent the system of supporting teachers and doing instructional strategies with all the diagnostic response that I was talking about. So that gap is already built in to the higher standards. Instead of doing that, we make it an event, they're adopted. We put in a test next year. We draw the dots together in 1 year and start hanging results for kids and teachers on something that should have been a process of solving the problem of how you make these real to parents and teachers. What does it look like when it's done well? How would you know it? Would you know a rubric if you drew one? And how do you make decisions about that that are as reliable and valid as an on-demand large-scale assessment, which other major countries that are competing with us, including Canada, is doing? Individual teachers, when oriented to this kind of stuff over time in a supportive, collegial, professional manner, when they look at student work and they share it among 10 of them, virtually paneling it, their critique is as valid and reliable as anything we're doing. Now, somehow, we've gone the other way. We try to teacher-proof our system. We have managed instruction, 6-week assessments. We still have not gotten teachers to own a testing. We've taken it completely out of their hands. It's an on-demand, large-scale system, or 5 from the district. But teachers administer them because they're somebody else's, and they get data back. And we're supposed to adjust instruction for a kid. That's almost impossible in those timelines. You can get some program evaluation out of that. But my point is, if you look at the in-task rewrite, the 2 biggest changes in the standards of practice, one was to acknowledge that teachers need to be much more engaged in the diagnostic side of assessments for the purposes of clinical diagnostic for students. And the other one is we've got to get the door open. It is public practice. It is instruction. And it's only instruction to the extent that my colleagues, are working with me, both in terms of my lesson construct, kind of a critique of how I'm doing, solving problems together for individual students that I can't meet the test with. And that kind of a culture is one of the primary things that will solve the problem of both retention and recruitment. Because the few places that I've had the opportunity to set up a state-sponsored or district-sponsored attempt to restaff or grow staff, first of all, it's always only happened with good and strong support from leadership, from union leadership. Sometimes at their cost, like any of us. But with that in place, you can get things done around the issue of peer structure to counsel in, peer structure to counsel out, and recruitment strategies that say, you step toward this work with the risks involved and the research and work necessary to change that culture, and not only will all victories be yours, but all failures will be mine. Because if I could have done it with the stroke of the pen at an event, I would have done it. If I could direct it and command it, I would have done it. And when we're talking about the scale we're talking about, with 50% of these, or 50% of the schools, or what was your statistic about this is all happening in a concentrated place. That's right, in a quarter of schools. And they all happen to be predictably placed. Well, that tells me that this is not a command and control answer. This is a search and create, if you will. And that cultural expectation and the support system behind it will solve both the problem of recruitment and retention, but it will only happen to the extent that we actually invest in the very people that we're asked to do in the work, but not allow them to ever fall back into, okay, I know how to do this. Because quite honestly, folks, at that scale, at the individual student level need, at the numbers we're talking about, none of us know how to do that like that. That is a collective search on a daily basis with the very best practice, constantly revisiting itself in terms of, did it work, and if it didn't, what could I do better tomorrow? Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. We've had 4 terrific perspectives on a major challenge that we face. And now let's get into some questions from you, and maybe potentially for the panelists for each other. I have to say, listening to the terrific data, what we heard about the role of working conditions and leadership, teacher voice, the need for infrastructure, I kind of feel like I am living in a parallel universe from the one in which I watch morning television or read newspaper editorials. And so an example of that is something that's been in the news a lot lately, which is tenure and due process, and high-profile lawsuits in California and now New York about its alleged connection to some of the kinds of issues that we're actually talking about here. So the question I have for anyone on the panel who wants to take it is to what extent is, first of all, is there any role that tenure is playing in the distribution of effective teaching, of quality teaching, I should say, to low-performing and high-poverty schools? And how much of our problem is a policy problem versus a narrative problem, and how do we tease those things apart? Anybody want to jump on that? Richard looks like everybody wants to. Okay, Richard, why don't we start with you?
Here,
You got it. I mean,
go ahead.
okay, well, it's to me, it's a no-brainer. We've all been in school. We know some teachers are better than others and work harder than others. And then we learn that our evaluation and reward systems and the tenure system and whatnot usually take the performance and the caliber of the teacher little into account. And so we have now a century or more of reforms trying to bring merit and performance of teachers into the equation. And we've had a century of failures. I wish we could learn from our mistakes. So yes, of course it's a no-brainer that some teachers are better than others, and often they're not rewarded. I'm a former high school teacher. I can remember the guy next door to me would read the newspaper all day. I would be up till midnight every night preparing interesting things. He was paid more than me. Okay, so we have a problem there. But, easier criticized than fixed. This is a tough nut to crack. It's very difficult to decide just who is more meritorious and then do it in an objective, feasible, cost-effective way. That's not so easy. I'd like to see it done. I have less and less faith all the time with the new value-added tool, which is the idea is that the teacher's performance is based on the gains in their students, and there's so many issues and problems with this that even statistician friends of mine who were totally wedded to it are now sort of throwing up their hands. I'm sure lots of states are implementing it nevertheless. So I'd love to see it fixed. In fact, I would have been paid more as a high school teacher, well, hopefully, but I was one of those who worked very hard. So, yes, there's problems there, but the idea that the source of the problems in the hard-to-staff schools is because we have lousy teachers is to me sort of absurd. There's a theory here that the problem with schools is teachers. We have these lousy teachers, and we can't fire them or we can't reward them, and if we could just get rid of these bad teachers, we could fix schools. To me, that's the underlying theory. Maybe I'm oversimplifying. I haven't read closely this California Vergara case, and so to me, that's just victim blaming. Yes, we do have some lousy teachers, but that's not the source of the problem. To me, back to my earlier comment, it's very simple. You want to get good teachers? Improve the quality of the teaching job. Make those places where you'd want to work. That's the problem. So I think I carried on a little too long.
Thank you. Helen, you look like you want to address that, or was it Peter? I'm not. Everybody does. All right, let's work our way back. Okay.
So I actually have very mixed views about tenure, somewhat for the same reasons you do. I mean, not all experienced teachers are, just because of their experience, stronger than teachers without experience. And in fact, but it is still the case that experience matters. And all of you who have backgrounds in teaching know that. And so then the question is, how do we get experienced teachers? So when I say experience matters, on average, teachers with more experience are stronger than teachers with weaker experience. And while some people would argue that that relationship holds just for the first few years of teaching, some new work that I'm about to publicize says that's true all the way up through 15, 20, 25 years of experience. On average, the more experienced teachers are stronger than the weaker teachers. But that doesn't mean every experienced teacher is stronger than the others. So what does this mean for tenure? That's tricky. We need to have some systems in place in order to make teaching a profession that people want to come into, people who have the potential to be very high-quality teachers who are willing to invest in themselves, to keep improving over time. Exactly what that structure should be, I'm not sure. And I do understand that in the Vergara case in California, that the California system was a pretty poor system. People were given tenure after 18 months, and it was very, very difficult to dismiss teachers. So we need a better system, but exactly the form of that system, I'm not sure. But just one last point related. A lot of things, if I heard you right, you want to have all this learning going on and cooperation among staff within the schools. How do you do that if you don't have experienced teachers in those schools who've been there for a while, who understand the mission, who've seen lots of different classroom types of situations and who've had experience dealing with those? So that's another reason why I think teacher experience is extremely important. But what the structure should be is unclear to me.
Yeah, I think we're all radically agreeing. I think it's only a red herring because the current system, any place where you can get tenure by seat time only, and especially in big overburdened system where there's not very much supervision for the first couple of years. So you end up literally with somebody getting tenure with not much of a judgment that was made to put that. But if we actually had in place the kinds of things that had career paths, so the tenure was lined up with kind of the first level of achieving that first professional, the first rung on a professional ladder, or the kind of roles that there are master, there wouldn't, by the very nature of the career ladder, there'd be master teachers that are part of any of the collegial structures. So a lot of this to me is structural. My experience, at least in both, more as an urban superintendent, but the same as a commissioner looking at trying to intervene, I thought the issues around the contracts around seniority rights for placement was a much bigger problem than tenure. Tenure was a question of making sure you didn't let anybody just get unsupervised and then end up with tenure. But once tenured, if the system also didn't have any kind of, as a matter of fact, that image of the person reading the newspaper and the person working hard, think about a place where that would not happen because the collegial structure would be such that that wouldn't be acceptable. That to me is structural stuff. Because I think the criticism right now between seniority and tenure as a problem is accurate, but they aren't the problem. It's the fact that there's no there to that.
All right. So I appreciate being able to address this too. I actually can't resist. So we all have to be, and I say this as someone who was, unrelenting about addressing teaching strength in everything we do. Don't settle for an administrator who shrugs her shoulders or his shoulders and says, I can't. In St. Paul, when I became president of the St. Paul Federation of Teachers, we actually negotiated peer assistance and review for that reason. We got to the point where we said, if you want something done right, you've got to do it yourself. And we instituted peer assistance and review, a full spectrum program, so that we were not just focusing on probationary teachers and teachers in need of improvement, but everyone could see their role in peer assistance and review, meaning you could access your consulting teacher to earn your national board certification, or if you were switching perhaps grade levels, going from teaching 7th and 8th grade English to teaching 11th grade English, a little bit of a jump, you might want that extra. You don't slip back. And I think we all have to be teaching strength. So once we instituted peer assistance and review in St. Paul, we have a 3-year probationary period. We didn't even wait 18 months. Year found a probationary teacher who was not meeting students, the privilege of standing in front of St. Paul students. So I strongly believe that it's the presence, not absence, of tenure and due process and seniority that can all be powerful tools in staffing and retaining teacher strength in high-need schools, specific to our topic. There is the very potential positive role of, if you have intentional supports, you say specifically for probationary teachers in high-need schools, while they're on their path to tenure, then that can actually, I mean, that is sort of that career blending we're talking about here, where if you have a new teacher with intentional supports during their probation with an experienced teacher, you could have a really powerful combination. Otherwise, keep them out of a high-need school until they've completed a meaningful 10-year program. Right? If you can't support that probationary teacher in a high-need school, then find a way to keep them out, so that they don't go through a 10-year process unsupported. And I would also say that you would not take worker protections away from those we need most to advocate for students and families in high-need situations. And so I actually believe that tenure, due process, and seniority, these can be really powerful tools in addressing this very question.
Thanks to all the panel on that one. Well, I'm going to again,
Trying
I
to
think
use
it's
that.
easier. Okay, so now we've got quite a set of questions here and lots of interest from the folks in the room. So we're going to try and pick up the pace of our answers a little bit. So this is for any and all. So we've just been kind of talking about some of the things that could be challenging in terms of why people would want to enter a profession without the supports they need. So this questioner wants to know, what specific changes would you suggest at the school level that would make hard-to-staff schools into places that teachers want to stay?
I'll give one and move. So one thing I would say to, going directly to one of Richard's slides, and that is I would give teachers more power in decision-making.
I'd improve school, make sure we have very involved making, involves a lot of as well.
I think that if it's a high-need school, and I don't know if this can be a problem at scale, but I still think it's real, because when you look at the intervention strategies that even remotely work, one of the variables is finding the time for the players who are trying to recreate something to have the time to do it. So I have no hesitation with dealing with what you would call caseload and/or time not directly with students. Now, again, that can be abused, you can screw it up, but as a given, if you're trying to turn a place around, you don't add that problem-solving time on top of a full caseload, especially with the kinds of differentiated staff we're currently dealing with and what we'd like to get to. It's time and caseload relief.
So we have a question about generational differences in the teaching profession. Can you speak to the way that generational differences, such as Generation Y versus baby boomers or Gen X, can influence retention? Sounds like one for you, Richard. I don't know.
Well,
I do, but I can't.
there is an argument made that you have different sort of personality coming into teaching these days. And I'm not quite sure about the,
I'm going to try this one instead.
yeah,
It's on.
okay, or is that on? Okay. I mean, what I find, I've been doing a whole project looking at how the teaching occupation, I said earlier, it's the largest occupation in the U.S., has been going through very radical demographic changes over the last two and a half decades with big implications, and that no one's really on top of them very much. And two trends are there's far more beginners than there used to be. I'm not quite sure this answers the question. We call it greening, that there's been so much hiring and there's been so much retiring and also pre-retirement quitting that the ratio of the veterans to beginners has dramatically changed. And a couple of years ago, the modal, the most common teacher, was someone in their first year. Now that's increased a little bit because hiring slowed down. So we have this greening thing going on, and a big chunk of it are mid-career switchers. That is, people that come in over age 30. That's a big piece there. The other piece attached to this, though, is that the instability, the turnover rates have increased over the last 2.5 decades, particularly amongst beginners. And so what we have is we have more flows coming into this gigantic occupation and more flows going out. But But I realize I don't think that answered the question, so anyhow.
The one, as a baby boomer, I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer this question. But one of the things I observed in the last 10 years is that the younger people coming in are much more inclined to think they're going into some place where there is a support system. They expect to have a collective experience and they weren't yet trained to close the door because the system is so dysfunctional and just do what you can do. And I find that to be an incredible opportunity that the bigger system tries to beat out of them. We don't provide any collegial support. We don't provide the kind of network that they expect to be there. And eventually they either leave or they close the door, which is what I think we've trained the senior teachers. This is overstated, but our culture has caused us to go into isolation, where I think the younger people that I've been dealing with are ready to be in a network of common search and common support.
I would just quickly say that one thing is to just name it in a school environment, because if you do not name it, there is real potential there for those generational differences to create a toxic environment because of the institutional thought around age and gender. I think plays a role in it too, that can permeate a schoolhouse door, right, and have all of us experience it. And I think there are two places to be able to name it. One is in the induction phase for those probationary teachers. When you have a thoughtful induction program and you talk about the life cycle of a career teacher, which is the way I learned about it in graduate school, and you help teachers in that induction phase see themselves on this continuum, and they see a role for themselves. Picturing themselves into the future in their career is helpful. The second is to have clear roles for all teachers in a building, and especially your experienced teachers. So to understand, whether that is a specific role about, once you get to this phase, you become a consulting, you're eligible to be a consulting teacher in the PAR program or whatever. When all teachers see that there are clear roles for them in that life cycle of a career teacher, they are also going to be a much more naturally respectful of where you are in that life cycle.
Thank you. So this is kind of a combination of two questions about sort of the overall professional environment and then the preparation for it. So we all seem to agree that schools would benefit from a professionally engaged, ambitious, creative faculty. We don't have that yet in all places. How do you manage that kind of transformation in a political context of decreasing trust of teachers and a professional culture that often accepts hierarchical top-down direction, managed curriculum, and some of the kinds of things Peter talked about earlier? And then along with that, how can we work from the preparation side to begin to change that?
Well, a couple of things, and I don't know if maybe I'm making, it seems to me that some of the infrastructure of the last 10 years is, I'm gonna just say, running its course. So unless I'm missing something, I'm finding an ever-enlarging circle of different stakeholders kind of agreeing we got to rethink the accountability piece. We got to rethink whatever. So part of it is already having conversations like this by whatever roles you're in, whether it's the university role or the community-based leadership role or the school, whatever. Because I think it is time for us to be having the conversations now, to be anticipating the opportunities, if you will. And I do think that ever since we hit the notion that it is the teacher, teaching is important, that has really opened the door to revisit things like peer review and career ladders, which have been on the table for 25 years. So some of this is an old idea with a new opportunity, but I do think the big difference between now and 25 years ago is what we have learned in terms of both the science of instruction and this incredible amount of data that's on the table that we don't know how to use yet. There's a lot of problem solving to be done. There's a lot of environments that can now be turned loose, as in decentralized, with good platforms of information in front of them, and the kinds of protocols that I think now, and the best example I have is we all been places where you finally got common planning time, you got all teachers together, 4 teachers or 5 teachers from the department, they had never had common planning time, they didn't know what to do with it. They ended up backing into their corner and preparing separately as opposed to being able to to actually plan together. Some of this takes the kind of training that has to come from master teachers who have been through experiences. So I would call it the coaching strategies. These are roles that are just beginning to be clear, and I think the word respectful is the right one. If once they're in place, people do learn the practices, and you slowly begin to change the larger practice of institutional support.
I just want to add something in addition to that, and I would say it means involving families in shaping this work. Because if we don't, we are still doing things to students and families rather than with them. And this does two things when you're really creating a partnership. It can eschew that top-down hierarchy, and it can forge common allies between those who care about students the most, their families and their educators.
So I'm going to ask one more question from my little pile here, and then give fair warning that I'm going to give each panelist 30 seconds to give us final words of wisdom on the topic at hand. So the question is that much of our discussion is centered around the teaching profession as a whole, but does that address the issue of the gaps within the profession? Are we just talking about needing to raise the bar across the board, or should we be worrying about narrowing gaps in differences in teaching?
It's funny, I thought the Met project, when I was with the Chiefs, I was part of at least monitoring and working with that project. Not directly, but we were all kind of watching for it. And I thought the best thing that came out of that is that after all that, the issue of serious differentiation right now is only at the top, very, very, very top and the very bottom, which I thought was both good and bad news. It means that this preoccupation with that kind of measurement, as if it's consequential for the 85% of us that are in the middle. That's not the right numbers, but you know what I mean. It positioned me that we've got to go back to the issue of reflecting and practice and trying to come up with good practice that we have results for, first of all, in our own instructional program, and back that into what it means to be, what does it mean to be differentiated? But I think we've taken the evaluation piece to get consequential before it got to be, Deborah Ball, when she talks about this, we're only now beginning to have a vocabulary that can talk about practice in a way that is precise enough, reflective enough, and directed enough, and it should be done positively. This is what I saw. This is what we're doing. It didn't work. What would you do differently? Without much more time spent on that level, then we only have little bits at the bottom, little bits at the top, and this large middle, which I think is wall-to-wall to everybody.
We're almost out of time. Sorry. Okay, anyone else want to address that one? So as we wrap up, we're in Washington. And Washington is a place that likes to make policies and pronouncements for the rest of the country. So if you kind of have a policy frame in mind at whatever level, I'd love if we could do a lightning round of considering the challenge of getting experienced and accomplished teachers into high-need schools. What are the few words that you want to leave us with as we think about this challenge going forward? And I think I'm going to try to go, unless I have a volunteer, I'll go in the reverse order that we started with.
I'm going to go back to the Michael Fullen.
Do you want to take this one?
I think it's about culture, building a culture that is focused relentlessly on students and instruction and accomplishment. But I can't help but finishing up with Mary Catherine's mention of parents. To me, right now, the policy environment is also being affected by the politics of all of this. And to me, the largest labor force in the country, one ally is the largest parent force in the country. And to the extent that the parent connection is still something contractual as opposed to straightforward professional, building an alliance, because most information about schools still comes from parents, to parents from teachers. To actually make that personal contact at some caseload that is absolutely given universally cost. You would change the political conversation in about 6 months if teachers accepted fundamentally their partnership with every parent of the children that they're teaching.
So this is a little broader than just the teacher part, but I think it's time for us to stop this overemphasis on testing for high-stakes purposes. That's consistent with what you said. Testing's important for diagnosing purposes, but one of the reasons I don't like the focus on testing, well, there are lots of reasons I don't.
Keep the mic close.
There are lots of reasons I don't like it, but this education system we have should be doing a lot more than just increasing the cognitive skills of students, and certainly more than a narrow set of cognitive skills that show up in the tests for math and reading. So I think I'd like to change the conversation to a broader set of something I would call educational goods. By that I mean the knowledge skills, attitudes, and dispositions that children need to lead a flourishing life and to contribute to the flourishing of others, and then to design policies around that broader set of skills and knowledge and attitudes and dispositions. Until we get away from this sole focus on measurable outcomes, easily measurable outcomes, the test scores, we're not going to move in that more productive direction.
Well, my view is that there's nothing wrong with accountability, and I would like to see it work, but I think that it hasn't been working because it's been one-sided, and it's basic management 101. You cannot hold employees accountable for things they have no control over. So first you give the employees the tools, the resources, the time, the autonomy, the training, and then you hold them accountable. You can't do one without the other. It's just a basic, it's common sense and it's management 101. And I think we've been doing it in a one-sided way. And there is a small but growing reform movement that I personally think is very promising and supported by the data, and they're called teacher-run schools. They often call themselves partnership schools. They model after law partnerships where the lawyers, the professionals, own the firm. And they're accountable, but they also make the decisions. They have both. And if it doesn't work, they go out of business. And particularly, they're often through charters. There's this growing movement, particularly in the Midwest, where the teachers run the school. They don't have a boss. They don't have a principal. They might hire someone to do a lot of the administrative stuff. They're accountable. These are often also low-income, poor schools. There's a whole movement, and it's very promising to me. And so it keeps accountability, but it gives the tools to those that we're asking to meet the bar, and that's precisely what we haven't been doing.
Great, thank you. Well, so first, I'm sending folks to your Management 101 class, because I think that's missing in the syllabus of some others I've seen. And I've had the chance to visit some of those teacher-run schools in the Midwest, and the other thing I will say is that they also share power, that decision-making power, with students and families as well. So it is truly like almost a community-run school. So I will say I would have a checklist of 3 things for high-need schools. Let's be careful with diagnosing the reasons. It is hard to staff for high need. Let us be inclusive in creating the remedy. And then let's be supportive in the application of that remedy.
Thank you all. I have to say that what I would love to do now is to take all of you on a Common Sense and Good Policy Roadshow. Not sure I'm going to have that opportunity. A quick announcement that you can go to the shankerinstitute.org website to find out about next month's conversation and to find out about a book party for Rick Kallenberg's new book, A Smarter Charter. But the thing we really want to do now is to give a huge thank you to a terrific panel for handling a provocative topic well.